Hello, my friend. Hi, everybody. Hurry up to join to the today last session. I hope you all will be doing great, guys. Let's join to the today last session. Tapping the screen and share the live. Thank you so much for your joining, guys. Hurry up, everyone, to join the city ring, guys, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Every single person to write your name in the chat, guys. Hurry up, guys, to join the city ring, guys. I have a lot of love and respect for you joining, guys. To write your name in the chat. My battery at 1%. I will recharge by. Where are you going, my dear? Let me write your name and let me write your name. You have to write your name in. You have to write your name in the chat, my dear. You have to write your name in the chat. Every respected member have to write your name in the chat, guys, making the like and subscribing to the channel. A lot of love and respect for you joining. Thank you so much for you being there. Nassim, how are you, dear Nassim? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, dear Nassim. A lot of love and respect for you joining, dear Nassim. Thank you so much for your joining. Jeannie, how are you, dear Jeannie? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, dear Jeannie. How are you, Jeannie? Thank you so much for your joining there. I have to love and respect for you joining. DJ, how are you, dear DJ? Thank you so much for your joining, dear DJ. Every respected member to write your name in the chat, guys, to do the super chat for the appreciation. German, how are you, German? Thank you so much for joining to sit to ring, dear German. A lot of love for you joining. Hasika, how are you, Hasika? Thank you so much for your joining, Hasika. How are you, Hasika? Thank you so much for your joining there. 24 member is watching right now. I remember to write your name in the chat and helping to completing my goal. Yeah, guys, I have a lot of love and respect for you joining. Gavin, how are you, dear Gavin? Thank you so much for joining. Oh, thank you so much for the handwrite. So the laughing disco is my favorite, guys. If someone can send. Magal, thank you so much, Magal. Laughing disco is my favorite, guys. Anyone can send the laughing disco or follow state or 6-7. Yeah, you can also, if you don't have a lot of coin, you can also send the 6-7. Angeli, how are you, dear Angeli? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Angeli. Melissa, how are you, dear Melissa? Thank you so much for your joining, pretty Melissa. Thank you so much for your joining. Manon, how are you, Manon? Thank you so much for your joining. Sunny, how are you, Sunny? Please, guys, send the laughing disco. Do the super chat. Emmanuel, how are you, Emmanuel? Thank you so much for your joining, Emmanuel. Emmanuel, thank you so much for your joining, mother. Irina, how are you, dear Irina? Thank you so much for your joining, pretty Irina. I have to love and respect for your joining. Amelia, how are you, dear Amelia? How are you, Amelia? Thank you so much for your joining. Thank you so much for your joining. Arena, I write your name there. Thank you so much for your joining. Gabriel, how are you, dear Gabriel? Thank you so much for your joining. Message, ring, dear Gabriela. Respected member to write your name in the chat, guys. Mirabella, how are you, Mirabella? Thank you so much for your joining. Please, guys, do the super chat, send the laughing disco. Thank you so much for your joining. Atti, how are you, pretty Atti? Thank you so much for your joining. Dia, how are you, dear Dia? Thank you so much for your joining. Dia, how are you, Dia? Thank you so much for your joining. Zelda, how are you, dear Zelda? Thank you so much for joining to ring. To skip the line, do the super chat, guys. Samelia, how are you, Samelia? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Samelia. Anna, how are you, dear Anna? Thank you so much for joining. You can send the laughing disco, guys. Danara, how are you, Danara? Thank you so much for joining to ring, Danara. How are you, dear Danara? Thank you so much for your joining. Thank you so much for your joining. Dahlia, how are you, dear Dahlia? How are you, Dahlia? Thank you so much for your joining, Dahlia. Every respected member to write your name in the chat, guys. Do the super chat. Hi, Pinky. How are you, Pinky? Thank you so much for joining, dear Pinky. Let me change the pen, guys. Yeah. Let me change the pen. Thank you so much for your joining, dear Pinky. To write your name in the chat, guys, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Every respected member to send the laughing disco. Pinky, how are you, dear Pinky? Thank you so much for joining, dear Pinky. Holly, how are you, Holly? Thank you so much for your joining to send the laughing disco, guys. Archie, how are you, Archie? Thank you so much for joining, dear Archie. How are you, Archie? Thank you so much for your joining. Bonnie, how are you, dear Bonnie? How are you, Bonnie? Thank you so much for joining, Bonnie. How are you, Bonnie? Thank you so much for your joining. Fiona, how are you, Fiona? Thank you so much for your joining. Someone do the super chat, guys, and send the laughing disco. Yeah, do the super chat for the appreciation. Binho, how are you, Binho? Thank you so much for joining, Binho, to helping me completing my goal. Jenko, how are you, Jenko? And also to skip the line, you should have to do the super chat, guys. Aris, how are you, Aris? Thank you so much for your joining. I'm writing the name of the every person on the list, guys. Cat CA, how are you, Cat CA? Thank you so much for joining to a ring, dear Cat CA. Thank you so much for your joining. Jenko, how are you, dear Jenko? Thank you so much for your joining, Jenko. To write your name, guys. Lava, how are you, dear Lava? How are you, pretty Lava? Thank you so much for your joining. Arena, how are you, Arena? Thank you so much for your joining to a ring, pretty Arena. Thank you, Arena. Seema, how are you, dear Seema? Thank you so much for your joining. Please make the like, guys. Max, how are you, dear Max? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Max. To do the super chat, guys. Lana, how are you, dear Lana? A lot of love and respect for your joining. Anaya, how are you, Anaya? Thank you so much for joining to stream, dear Anaya. Thank you so much for your joining, pretty Anaya. Zala, how are you, dear Zala? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Zala. How are you, Zala? Please, guys, do the super chat, guys. Send the laughing disco. Tani, how are you, dear Tani? Thank you so much for your joining, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Thank you so much for your joining. Mercedes, how are you, Mercedes? Thank you so much for your joining. NC, how are you, dear NC? Thank you so much for joining, NC, to do the super chat. Send the laughing disco. Yeah, guys, and also Lana, how are you, dear Lana? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Lana. Thank you so much for your joining to sit in there. You're watching day by day. Yeah, right. Thank you, Asbella. How are you, dear Asbella? Thank you so much for your joining, Asbel. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Thank you so much for your joining. Please, someone send the laughing disco, guys. And Hadi, how are you, dear Hadi? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Hadi. How are you, Hadi? Thank you so much for your joining. Azka, how are you, dear Azka? Thank you so much for joining, Azka. How are you, Azka? Please, someone do the super chat, guys, and also yeah, do the super chat, and also to send the laughing disco. Anthony, how are you, dear Anthony? How are you, Anthony? Thank you so much for your joining. I remember to write that. Also, you can send your flag for making the show. See, Sawa, how are you, Sawa? Thank you so much for joining. Kale, thank you, Kale. Thank you so much, Kale. How are you, dear Kale? Thank you so much. Kale, can you send a laughing disco? Laughing disco is my favorite gift. Yeah, if you can, Kale. Thank you so much, Kale. God bless you. Can you send a laughing disco or a 6-7 for my appreciation? Thank you, Charlie. How are you, dear Charlie? How are you, dear Charlie? Thank you so much for your joining there. God bless you, Mahira. How are you, Mahira? Thank you so much, Kale. God bless you, my dear. A lot of love and respect. Thank you, Pablo. How are you, dear Pablo? Please, guys, do the super chat for the appreciation, guys. Asbela, I write your name, my dear Asbela. How are you, Asbel? Okay, Asbel. Marek, I write your name, Marek. Okay, Marek. Thank you, Marek, for joining me, Marek. Thank you so much for your joining, Marek. Malina, I write your name. Okay, Malina, thank you so much for joining me, Malina. God bless you, dear. Thank you for joining. Thank you for joining me. Thank you, Sarah. I write your name. Okay, Sarah. Thank you, pretty Sarah. God bless you, pretty Sarah. Thank you. Julie, how are you, dear Julie? Thank you so much for Julie. I write your name. Okay, Julie. Thank you so much for joining. Lana, I write your name. Okay, dear Lana. Thank you so much for your joining, Lana. God bless you. Lara, I write your name. Okay, dear Lara. Please, guys, do the super chat for the appreciation. Sophia, how are you, Sophia? Thank you so much for joining, Sophia. Thank you so much for your joining, my dear Sophia. Dalma, how are you, dear Dalma? Thank you so much for your joining, Dalma. God bless you, Dalma. Thank you, Angie. How are you, dear Angie? Thank you so much for joining me, Angie. I have to love and respect for your joining. Zala, how are you, dear Zala? Thank you so much, dear Zala. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Aleph, how are you, dear Aleph? How are you, Aleph? Thank you so much for your joining, Aleph. God bless you, Aleph. Thank you so much for your joining. Rory, how are you, dear Rory? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Rory. God bless you. Alice, how are you, dear Alice? Thank you so much for your joining, Alice. God bless you, Alice. Thank you so much. Dalma, how are you, Dalma? Thank you so much, Dalma. A lot of love and respect. Yeah, guys. Giusa, how are you, dear Giusa? How are you, Giusa? Thank you so much for your joining. Someone do the super chat for the appreciation, guys. Thank you so much for your joining. Moses, how are you, Moses? Thank you so much for your joining, Moses. How are you, Moses? Thank you so much for your joining. Thank you so much for your joining. Thank you. God bless you, mother. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Thank you so much for your joining, guys. Thank you, Brazil. How are you, Brazil? Thank you so much for your joining, Brazil. How are you, Brazil? to write your name in the chat, guys. Thank you. Zinab, how are you, dear Zinab? How are you, Zinab? Thank you so much for joining, pretty Zinab. How are you, Zinab? Thank you so much for your joining. Kaka, how are you, dear Kaka? Thank you so much for joining, dear Kaka. A lot of love and respect for your joining. And yeah, guys, Halle, how are you, dear Halle? How are you, Halle? Thank you so much for your joining, Halle. How are you, dear? Thank you so much for your joining. Please do the super chat. Someone do the super chat for my appreciation, guys. Orista, how are you, Orista? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Orista. A lot of love. Ahmad, how are you, Ahmad? Thank you so much, Ahmad. Ahmad, how are you, dear Ahmad? Thank you so much for joining my stream, Ahmad. Anybody can do the super chat for my appreciation, guys. Arham, how are you, dear Arham? Thank you so much for your joining, Arham. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Anna, how are you, dear Anna? Thank you so much for your joining, Anna. Lois, how are you, dear Lois? How are you, Lois? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Lois. Thank you so much for your joining. Thank you. And to Hassan, how are you, Hassan? Thank you so much for your joining. Hassan, sorry, Hassan. Thank you so much for joining to stream, dear Hassan. Thank you. And Dahlia, how are you, dear Dahlia? A lot of love and respect for your joining. Thank you so much for your joining, dear. To write your name in the chat, guys. Hurry up, every respected member. Camille, how are you? To skip the line, do the super chat. Yeah, to skip the line, do the super chat, guys. Yunchi, how are you, Yunchi? Thank you so much, dear. Every respected member, to write your name in the chat, guys. You are all very respectful for me, guys. I have a lot of respect of every single person. Those have to join the stream, to write their name on the chat, and have also to send the gift. No, how are you, dear? No, thank you so much for joining, dear. No, a lot of love and respect, dear. No, Dency, how are you, Denasi? How are you, Denasi? Thank you so much for your joining to stream, dear Denasi. How are you, Denasi? Thank you so much for your joining. Leona, how are you, dear Leona? Thank you so much for your join. Leon, thank you so much for your joining, Leon. Victoria, how are you, dear Victoria? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Victoria. Kaisar, how are you, Kaisar? Thank you so much for your joining, Kaisar. How are you, Kaisar? And thank you so much for your joining. Gaston, how are you, Gaston? Thank you so much for your joining, Gaston. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Thank you so much for your joining, Gaston. I write your name there. Zaika, how are you, dear Zaika? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Zaika. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Thank you so much for your joining. To write your name in the chat, guys. Making the like and subscribing to the channel. Naeem, how are you, Naeem? Thank you so much for joining, dear Naeem. Please, guys, someone do the super chat, and also do the super chat, and also send the laughing disco, guys. Gaston, thank you, Gaston. Ona, how are you, dear Ona? Thank you so much for joining, dear Ona. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Fatima, how are you, Fatima? Thank you so much for joining to stream, dear Fatima. Amy, how are you, dear Amy? Thank you so much for your joining, Amy. How are you, Amy? Thank you so much for joining. And notes, how are you? And notice, how are you? And notice. Thank you so much for joining. Nara, how are you, Nara? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Nara. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Marco, you are the great. Marco, how are you, dear Marco? Thank you so much for your joining. Baron, how are you, dear Baron? A lot of love and respect for your joining, dear Baron. Maria, how are you, pretty Maria? Thank you so much for your joining, pretty Maria. Thank you so much, Maria. And Bahrain, Arajan name Axel. How are you, Azal? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Azal. A lot of love and respect. I have only a one request from the every single person. Just you should have to send the laughing disco for my appreciation, guys. Amalia, how are you, dear Amalia? How are you, Amalia? And also to do the super chat, yeah, guys, to help me completing my goal. Asal, how are you, Asal? Thank you so much for joining to sharing. Carolina, how are you, dear Carolina? If someone has do the super chat, I will give the blue title. Yeah, if someone has to do the super chat, I will also subscribe him and also to give him the blue title of my screen. Kale, how are you, dear Kale? Thank you so much for your joining, Kale. How are you, Kale? Thank you so much for your joining. Thank you, Hasil. How are you, Hasil? How are you, Hasil? Thank you so much for joining, Hasil. How are you, Hasil? Thank you so much for your joining. And Kyo, Ki. How are you, Ki? Thank you so much for joining. Minha, how are you, dear Minha? How are you, Minha? Everybody, please to write your name in the chat, guys. Mystery, how are you, Miss Mitsuri? How are you, Mitsuri? How are you, Mitsuri? Thank you so much for joining, Mitsuri. Please, guys, do the super chat, guys. Area, how are you, Area? How are you, Area? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Area. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Zaika, how are you, dear Zakia? How are you, Zakia? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Zakia. Thank you so much for your joining, Zakia. Rifaka, how are you, dear Rifaka? Thank you so much for your joining. Please, guys, do the super chat, send the laughing disco. Azan, how are you, dear Azan? Thank you so much for your joining, Azan. How are you, Azan? Thank you so much for your joining. Jose, how are you, dear Jose? Thank you so much for your joining, Jose. Thank you so much for your joining. Monica, how are you, dear pretty Monica? Thank you so much for your joining, Monica. How are you, Monica? Addie, how are you, dear Addie? Thank you so much for your joining, Addie. How are you, Addie? Thank you so much for your joining, Addie. Alicine, how are you, dear Alicine? Hi, Alicine. How are you, dear? Thank you so much for your joining, Alicine. Rose, how are you, dear Rose? Thank you so much for joining, dear Rose. A lot of love and respect for your joining. No, how are you, dear No? Thank you so much for your joining. No, how are you, No? Alois, how are you, Alois? Alois, how are you, Alois? Thank you so much for your joining, Alois. Thank you so much for your joining. Camille, how are you, dear Camille? Thank you so much for joining, Camille. I have to love all the US, UK, Canadian, Brazilian people, and all of the lovers have to join my stream and also to support me. I have to write my name, Aman. How are you, Aman? Thank you so much for your joining, Aman. How are you, Aman? Thank you so much for your joining. Danara, how are you, Danara? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Danara. How are you, Danara? Thank you so much, Danare. How are you, Danare? Thank you so much for your joining. Leos, how are you, Leos? How are you, Leos? Thank you so much for your joining. Please do the super chat, guys. Fatima, how are you, dear Fatima? Thank you so much for joining, Fatima. Thank you. Amin, how are you, Amin? Thank you so much for joining, dear Amin. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Someone do a super chat, guys, please. Sophia, how are you, dear Sophia? Thank you so much for your joining, Sophia. Bushra, how are you, pretty Bushra? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Bushra. Thank you so much for your joining. Leos, how are you, dear Leos? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Leos. Ala, how are you, dear Ala? Thank you so much for your joining, Ala. Thank you, Ala, for your joining. Amil, how are you, dear Amil? How are you, Amil? Thank you so much for your joining, Amil. Thank you so much for your joining. Alara, how are you, Alara? Thank you so much for your joining to stream, dear Alara. Lisa, how are you, pretty Lisa? Thank you so much for your joining. Thank you so much for your joining. Later, how are you, dear lady? Thank you so much for your joining, dear lady. Please, guys, someone do the super chat. Ala, how are you? Sorry, yeah, Ala, how are you, Ala? Someone do the super chat, guys, and send the laughing disco. Laughing disco are for lost it. These are both are my favorite, guys. Dabe is favorite, and also the laughing disco is my dream gift. Yeah. Visula, how are you, Visula? Thank you so much for joining, Visula. How are you, Visula? Thank you so much for your joining, Visula. To write your name in the chat, guys. Hurry up, guys. Every respected member, Manoon. How are you, dear Manoon? Thank you so much for joining, pretty Manoon. Thank you so much for your joining. Danana, how are you, Danana? Thank you so much for joining to Citrim, Danana. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Enoch, how are you, NC? How are you, NC? Thank you so much for joining. Lorena, how are you, Lorena? Thank you so much for your joining, Lorena. A lot of love and respect for your joining, dear Lorena. Wariam, how are you, Wariam? Thank you so much for joining to Citrim, dear Wariam. God bless you, dear Wariam. Thank you so much for your joining. Kalle, how are you, dear Kalloy? How are you, Kalloy? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Kalloy. Thank you so much for your joining, my dear. To write your name in the chat. Megan, how are you, dear Megan? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Megan. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Loyona, how are you, dear Loyona? Please, guys, someone help me to completing my goal, guys. Loyona, Hera, how are you, pretty Hera? Thank you so much for joining, dear Hera. Please, guys, encourage the likes, guys. Yeah, encourage the likes. Blessing, how are you, dear Blessing? Thank you so much for joining, Blessing. A lot of love and respect. Johan, how are you, dear Johan? Thank you so much for joining, Johan. How are you, Johan? Thank you so much for joining, my dear. Dabe, how are you, dear Dabe? Thank you so much for your joining, Dabe. Please, guys, do the super chat and write your name in the chat. Levy, how are you, Levy? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Levy. Thank you so much for your joining. John, how are you, John? Zarila, how are you, Zarila? How are you, Zarila? Thank you so much for joining to Citrim, Zarila. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Thank you so much for your joining to Citrim. Alia, how are you, pretty Alia? Thank you so much for your joining. Please, guys, send the laughing disco. Leona, how are you, dear Leona? Thank you so much for your joining. And do the super chat, guys. You should have to click on the money icon. You will be showing on the left corner. You will be showing a money icon. Click on the money icon to do the super chat. Make a small donation, guys. Asa, how are you, dear Asa? Thank you so much for joining to Citrim, dear Asa. A lot of love and respect for you joining. Thank you so much for joining my Citrim, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Anthony, how are you, dear Anthony? Thank you so much for joining to Citrim, dear Anthony. Thank you so much for joining. Masa, how are you? Hurry up, guys. Name in the chat. Rory, how are you, Rory? Please, guys, do the super chat and also to write your name in the chat, guys. Yeah, Mia, how are you, pretty Mia? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Mia. A lot of love and respect for you joining. Lara Raj, how are you, Lara Raj? Thank you so much for your joining to Citrim, dear Lara Raj. Thank you so much for your joining. Loki, how are you, Loki? Thank you so much for joining, Loki. Hurry up, guys, to write your name in the chat, guys. Fama, how are you, Fama? Thank you so much for joining to City Ring, Fama. Please, guys, someone do a super chat, guys. Lewis, how are you, dear Lewis? Yeah, guys, you should do the super chat for my appreciation. Thank you so much for your joining to City Ring. Won he, how are you, Won he? Aura, how are you, Aura? Thank you so much for joining, Aura. How are you, Aura? Thank you. Welcome there. Mustafa, how are you, Mustafa? How are you, Mustafa? Thank you so much for your joining, Mustafa. Hurry up, guys, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Jesu, how are you, dear Jesu? Thank you so much for joining to City Ring, dear Jesu. A lot of love and respect for you joining. Yeah, guys, just you should have to write your name in the chat, guys. Rayan, how are you, Rayan? Thank you so much for joining, dear Rayan. A lot of love and respect for you joining. eBay, how are you, eBay? Thank you so much for joining, eBay. If you have to write more spam, then you will be got the time out. It's a last warning for you. Yeah, thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for your joining. Jassy, how are you, dear Jassy? Thank you so much for joining to City Ring, dear Jassy. Thank you so much for your joining, Jassy. How are you, Jassy? Thank you so much for joining. Please, guys, to write your name in the chat, making the like and subscribing to the channel. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Aisha, how are you, pretty Aisha? Thank you so much for joining to City Rim, dear Aisha. Thank you so much for your joining. Visna, how are you, Visna? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Visna. Andrea, how are you, Andrea? Encourage the likes, guys. Danushka, how are you, Danushka? Thank you so much for joining, Danushka. Siona, how are you, dear Siona? Thank you so much for joining to City Rim, dear Siona. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Welcome, dear. Abdul Samad, how are you, Abdul Samad? Thank you so much for joining. Siona, I write your name here. Samad, how are you, Samad? Thank you so much for joining, Samad. Aroha, how are you, dear Aroha? Thank you so much for joining, Aroha. Savezi, how are you, Savezi? Someone do the super chat, guys. Megan, how are you, Megan? Mia, how are you, Mia? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Mia. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Lucifer, how are you, Lucifer? Thank you so much for joining to City Rim, Lucifer. Sambe, how are you, Sambe? Thank you so much for joining, dear Sambe. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Malvina, how are you, Malvina? Thank you so much for joining, Malvina. How are you, Malvina? Thank you so much for your joining to City Rim. To write your name in the chat, guys. Tanin, how are you, Tanin? Levy, how are you, Levy? How are you, Levy? Thank you so much for joining, dear Levy. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Faka, how are you, Faka? Thank you so much for joining, dear Faka. Sophia, how are you, dear Sophia? Thank you so much for joining, dear Sophia. Kale, how are you, dear Kale? Thank you so much for joining, dear Kale. A lot of love and respect for you joining. Please, guys, do the super chat and send the laughing disco. Malky, how are you, Malky? Thank you so much for joining, dear Malky. Andori, how are you, dear Andori? Thank you so much for joining, dear Andori. Yeah, guys, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Hajar, how are you, Hajar? Thank you so much for joining to City Ring. Happy birthday to Danala. How are you, Danala? Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for joining, Danala. Happy birthday to you, my dear. Thank you so much for you joining. A lot of love and respect for you joining, Danala. Danala, happy birthday to you, my dear. Thank you so much for you joining my city ring, making the like and subscribing. Thank you. You should also have to subscribe my channel. You can do the super chat, my dear. If you have can to do the super chat, Amelie, how are you, Amelie? Thank you so much for you joining to city ring. Yeah, guys, click on the money icon to do the super chat for my appreciation. Thank you so much for you joining, Amelie. How are you, Amelie? Evelyn, how are you, dear Evelyn? How are you, Evelina? Thank you so much for you joining, dear Evelina. Adore, how are you, Adore? Thank you so much for joining, Adore. A lot of love and respect for you joining. To write your name in the chat, guys. So welcome there. Yeah, damn, how are you, damn? Thank you so much. Angelina, I can write your name, my dear. It's a last warning. Then you will be get time out from my screen. Yeah. You know, you have to make a lot of spam mix. You're disturbing me. Damn, how are you, damn? Thank you so much for joining, damn. And Lekesh, how are you? You're Lekesh. Sita, how are you there, Likishita? How are you, Likishita? Can Scene, how are you, Can Scene? How are you, Can Scene? Thank you so much for your joining, Can Scene. Salim, how are you, Salim? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Salim. I remember, please, to write your name in the chat, guys. Claudia, how are you, dear Claudia? How are you, Claudia? Please do the super chat, send the follow state. Yeah, guys, if you can to send the laughing disco. Awa, how are you, Awa? Thank you so much for joining, Awa. Alisa, how are you, Alisa? How are you, pretty Alisa? Thank you so much for your joining. For my support, you can do the super chat, guys. Ishak, how are you, Ishak? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Ishak. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Nicola, how are you, Nicola? Thank you so much for your joining, Nicola. How are you, Nicola? Please do the super chat, guys, and also send the laughing disco. Thank you, Nicola. Eileen, how are you, Eileen? How are you, Eileen? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Eileen. Alice, how are you, dear Alice? Thank you so much for your joining to City Ring, dear Alice. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Okayan, how are you, Okayan? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Okayan. Massey, how are you, dear Massey? Thank you so much for joining, dear Massey. to write your name in the chat, guys. Sude, how are you, dear Sude? Thank you so much for joining, dear Sude. To write your name in the chat, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Sophia, how are you, pretty Sophia? Please, guys, do the super chat, send the laughing disco for the appreciation. Thank you so much for your joining. Director, how are you, Director, how are you, Director? Thank you so much for your joining. Mubarak, how are you, Mubarak? Thank you so much for your joining, Mubarak. How are you, Mubarak? Thank you so much for your joining, Mubarak. Hurry up, guys, to write your name in the chat, guys. Making the like and subscribing to the channel. Hurry up, guys. Every respected member have to write your name in the chat. Sorry, how are you, sorry? Theo, how are you there, Theo? Thank you so much for your joining, Theo. How are you, Theo? Victoria, how are you, Victoria? How are you, Victoria? Thank you so much for your joining, Victoria. Danalo, how are you, Danalo? Thank you so much for your joining to sit ring there, Danalo. Saloni, how are you, Saloni? Thank you so much for your joining to sit ring there, Saloni. Sham, how are you, Sham? Thank you so much for your joining to sit ring there, Sham. Lakishta, how are you, Lakishta? How are you, Lakishta? Thank you so much for your joining, Lakishta. Tahiri, how are you, Tahiri? Thank you so much for your joining, Tahiri. Gabriel, how are you, dear Gabriel? Thank you so much for your joining, Gabriel. How are you, Gabriel? Hurry up, guys, to write your name in the chat, guys. Making the like and subscribing to the channel. Rosel, how are you, Rosel? How are you, Rosel? Thank you so much for your joining to sit rim, Rosalie, how are you, Rosalie? Thank you so much for your joining. Mariam, how are you, dear Mariam? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Mariam. Zachariah, how are you, dear Zachariah? Thank you so much for your joining, Zachariah. Here to write your name in the chat, guys. How are you, dear Rosel? Thank you so much for joining my stream. Rosel, can you do the super chat? Mimosa, how are you, Mimosa? Thank you so much for your joining, Mimosa. Gabriel looks that I write your name on here. Danor, how are you, Danor? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Donor. Dunayer, how are you, Dunayer? Thank you so much for your joining, Dunayer. How are you, dear Dunayer? Daniel, how are you, Daniel? Thank you so much for your joining to stream, Daniel. Alice, how are you, Alice? Thank you so much for your joining to stream, Alice. Hamza, how are you, dear Hamza? Thank you so much for your joining, Hamza. How are you, Hamza? Zainab, how are you, Zainab? Thank you so much for your joining, Zainab. How are you, Zainab? Sultan, how are you, Sultan? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Sultan. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Rose, how are you, Rose? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Rose. Almas, how are you, Almas? Thank you so much for your joining to sit to rim dear Almas. Albe, how are you, Albe? Please, guys, do the super chat, guys. Game Down, how are you, Game Down? Thank you so much for your joining, Game Down. How are you, Game Down? Thank you so much for your joining, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Arsalan, how are you, Arsalan? Thank you so much for your joining, Arsalan. Misa, how are you, Misa? Thank you so much for your joining, Misa. And lot of love and respect for your joining, dear Misa. Saf, how are you, Saf? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Saf. Mujtiba, how are you, Mujtiba? Huzaifa, how are you, Huzaifa? Every respected member have to write your name in the chat, guys. Ottoman, how are you, Ottoman? Thank you so much for joining, Ottoman. Jawd, how are you, Jawd? Thank you so much for joining to sit rim, Jawd. Allol, how are you, Allol? Thank you so much for your joining, Allol. How are you, Allol? Karam, how are you, Karam? Due, how are you, Due? Thank you so much for your joining, dear. Hurry up, guys, to write your name in the chat. Hello, Aisha. How are you, Aisha? Thank you so much for joining. Vishal, how are you, Vishal? Ava, how are you, Ava? Mia, how are you, Mia? Hurry up, guys, encourage the likes, guys, encourage the likes. Welcome. Encourage the likes and do the super chat, guys. Click on the money icon to helping me completing my goal. Okay, Barros, it's your last name. Okay, Barros, if you have to do many names, you will be got the time only. Eric, how are you, Eric? Thank you so much for joining, Eric. How are you, Eric? Thank you so much for joining, Eric. Liv, how are you, dear Liv? Thank you so much for joining, dear Liv. Defan, how are you, Defan? Thank you so much for your joining to sit to rim, Defan. Please, guys, do the super chat, guys. Defin, how are you, Defin? Lara, how are you, dear Lara? Thank you so much for joining, dear Lara. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Alia, how are you, Alia? Thank you so much for your joining, Alia. Please, guys, to write your name and do the super chat, guys. Malaysia, how are you, dear Malaysia? How are you, Malaysia? Thank you so much for your joining, Malaysia. Rafe, how are you, Rafe? Thank you so much for your joining, Rafe. Zara, how are you, Zara? Thank you so much for joining, Zara. To write your name in the chat, guys. Rachida, how are you, Rachida? Thank you so much for joining to sit to ring, Rachid. Ala, how are you, dear Ala? Thank you so much for you joining to sit to ring, dear Ala. Jocelyn, how are you, Jocelyn? Thank you so much for joining to sit to ring, Jocelyn. Mary, how are you, Mary? Thank you so much for joining, Mary. Alice, how are you, Alice? Thank you so much for joining, Alice. Maury and Alice. Danny, how are you, Danny? Marvin, how are you, Marvin? Thank you so much for joining to sit to ring, dear Marvin. Hourly, how are you, Hourly? Thank you so much for joining to sit to ring, Hourly. How are you, Hourly? How are you, Hourly? Alan, how are you, Alan? Thank you, Alan. Thank you so much for joining to sit to ring, Alan. Please, guys, do the super chat, guys, for my support, for the appreciation. You can do the super chat. Aline, how are you, Aline? To write your name in the chat, guys. Gladys, how are you, Gladys? Thank you so much for joining, Gladys. Hayome, how are you, Hayome? Thank you so much for joining to sit to ring, Hayome. Gabriel, how are you, Gabriel? Thank you so much for joining to the sit to ring, Gabriel. Revza, how are you, dear Revza? Thank you so much for joining to sit to ring, Revza. Lini, how are you, Lini? Lini, can you do the super chat or send the laughing disco? Mina, how are you, Mina? Muhammad, how are you, Muhammad? Lini, I write your name pretty. Please, guys, do the super chat, guys. Click on my call to do the super chat. Derek, how are you, Derek? Thank you so much for joining to sit to ring, dear Derek. A lot of love and respect for you joining. Hurry up, guys. Every respecting member have to write your name in the chat, guys. Making the like and subscribing to the channel. Anna, how are you, dear Anna? Thank you so much for your joining, Anna. Yahya, how are you, Yahya? Thank you so much for your joining. Yahya, I write your name earlier. Shamir, how are you, Shamir? Thank you so much for joining to sit to ring, dear Shamir. Harry, how are you, Harry? Ali, how are you, Ali? Richard, how are you, Richard? Almer, how are you, Almer? Thank you so much for joining the Almer. Ivan, how are you, Ivan? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Ivan. Olivia, how are you, Olivia? How are you, Olivia? Thank you so much for your joining, Olivia. How are you, Olivia? A lot of love and respect for you joining to send the laughing disco, guys. Samir, how are you, Samir? Thank you so much for your joining, Samir. How are you, Samir? Ali, how are you, Ali? Thank you so much for joining, Ali. Please, guys, do the super chat and also send the laughing disco. Monica, how are you, Monica? Thank you so much for your joining, Monica. Danala, how are you, Danala? Thank you so much for joining to sit to ring, Danala. Nicole, how are you, Nicole? Thank you so much for joining to assist to ring, dear Nicole. Alayan, how are you, Alayan? Thank you so much for your joining to assist to ring. Nikki, how are you, Nikki? Please, guys, send the laughing disco, do the super chat, guys. Doreva, how are you, Doreva? Thank you so much for your joining, Doreva. Daniel, how are you, Daniel? Thank you so much for your joining to sit to ring, Daniel. Monica, I write your name. Looks that I'm writing once again. Monica, how are you, Monica? Thank you so much for joining, Monica. Maharo, how are you, Maharo? Gazely, how are you, dear Gazely? Thank you so much for your joining to Setterim. Zale, how are you, Zale? Thank you so much for your joining, Zale. Halle, how are you, Halle? Soul, how are you, Soul? Thank you for subscribing. Anaya, how are you, Anaya? Thank you for subscribing, dear Mia. Thank you. Levi, how are you, Levi? To write your name in the chat, guys. Amir, how are you, Amir? Leona, how are you, Leona? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Leona. Please, guys, do the super chat, guys. Jannale, how are you, Jannale? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Jannale. Hisang, how are you, Hisang? Thank you so much for your joining. Rubia, how are you there, Rubia? Levy, how are you, Levy? Jai, how are you, Jai? Hourly, how are you, Hourly? Armand, how are you, Armand? Osman,